Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I think we have there's a few more people on the RSVP list, but I'm going to start with the introduction. So for those who don't know me, my name is James Glsen, and I am the curator of contemporary art here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, with this thing around my neck, which is a little ridiculous. Let me move that. I'll put my mask back on. And I have the great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Alexander Alberro, the Virginia Blodell Wright, 1951, Professor of Art History at Barnard College in Columbia. And I'm pleased to welcome him as part of the programming around Going Global Abstract Art at Mid-Century. This exhibition is on view until September 24th, and everything in the show is exclusively from this museum's, I think, surprisingly broad holdings in abstract art from the middle of the 20th century. And the artists in the exhibition demonstrate that the art world was already globalized in the post-World War II period. And they also show how widely abstraction traveled in all the forms that it took in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. I also want to take this opportunity, before saying a little bit more about Alex, to thank the Santa Barbara Museum of Art Women's Board, who wholly underwrote this exhibition, as they underwrite lots of programming, both exhibitions and for educational programming throughout the institution. And also thank Lauren Caranzia and Sam Silvera for all of their work to bring Alex here today. Now, Alex is a particularly apt person to invite because of his writings on Latin American abstraction, in particular Jesus Rafael Soto and Carlos Cruz Diaz, of which the museum has some sterling examples on view upstairs in the exhibition. In particular, his book from 2017, Abstraction in Reverse, The Reconfigured Spectator in Mid-20th Century Latin American Art, was very helpful to me as I was thinking about this show. And copies of it are on the table outside if you would like to purchase a copy and have Alex sign it. It's it's typical of Alex in that it is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, very accessible, and thinks very much about both forms, what you see on the we'll say canvas, though they're not really canvases in many cases, but the forms you see in the artwork and how those relate to social contexts or collectors, or in some cases, bigger questions about politics and the politics of Latin America in that period. More generally, though, Alex has published really widely on art of the 1960s up to the present, and I first came to know his brand of research of careful archival work in his 2003 book, Conceptual Art and the Politics of Publicity, which I learned an awful lot, and I know a lot of other people did as well. And I can't emphasize enough, Alex is someone whose writings are a standard part of what undergraduate, graduate students, artists, curators like myself are reading. He's a very important figure and writer in the art world today, so we are especially pleased to have him in Santa Barbara, not least because I learned less than a week ago he got off of a plane from Nairobi, so he's a busy man this summer. Some of his other books that are musts for your bookshelf, if you're thinking about art of the 1960s and onward, is Conceptual Art, a Critical Anthology from 1999, Institutional Critique and Anthology of Artist Writing from 2009, and Art After Conceptual Art. Alex has even just finished another book that's thinking about the borders and margins of the art world. And beyond all of these book-length studies, he's also focused on particular artists, including Wilfredo Lamb. We have a beautiful Lamb in our collection, which was at just at Pace Gallery for Pace Gallery's exhibition on Lamb, which Alex wrote for that show. And Alex has also written on Ligia Pape, Patrick Ireland, Barbara Kruger, Hans Hacke, Stan Douglas, Julio Leparc, Andrea Fraser, and I could go on and on and on, but I won't. It's just a great pleasure to have him here and to speak today. Okay, thank you, Alex.
Oh, you're going to switch it up. Yeah. Well, thank you, James. Before I begin, I'd also like to thank Lauren Krazia for the invitation and all the help in coordinating, both James and Lauren for all the help in coordinating this lecture. My visit to Santa Barbara. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for coming on this beautiful afternoon. I'll present a paper about abstract art, which I think relates quite well to the exhibition that's on display here. It should be about 40 minutes or so, and then I'm happy to take as many questions as you have. Is there any way that we can dim the light on me, just so that I'm not blinded? Well, it's this one here. Okay, so the title of the paper is, as you can see on the screen, Activating the Spectator by Reshaping the Aesthetic Field, Op, Kinetic, and Participatory Art in the mid-20th century. And I want to touch on those three dimensions of art, that is op art, kinetic art, and participatory art. Participatory art is really the starting point for the paper for me because my field of expertise is contemporary art, and a lot of contemporary art has a participatory dimension, and therefore I wanted to. In researching the project that culminated in the book that I published a few years ago, Abstraction in Reverse, I wanted to research the underpinnings of the participatory dimension that came to characterize so much contemporary art, some of which will be called relational aesthetics or participatory actions and many other names. Now, artists working in several cities during the mid-20th century altered the nature of modern art. In this critical transformation, practitioners reimagined art's relation to its public and granted the spectator, the viewer, the audience, a more significant role than ever before in the realization of an artwork. These developments unfolded in a complicated mediation of the form of abstract art. European modernist artists such as Theo van Doesburg or Piet Mondrian or Max Bill and others referred to as concrete art. This type of abstract art, concrete art, resonated in South America in particular in the late 1940s and 50s as artists with modernist ambitions banished all vestiges of the tropological, metaphorical production of art, metaphorical production in art. They sought to eliminate modern art's continued dependence on the figural, on the metaphor, on tropes, and to arrive at an understanding of, in a word, the literal dimension of art. And I'm juxtaposing the literal, which is the matter-of-fact dimension of art, versus the figural, which is the metaphorical, elusive, connotative dimension of not just art, but any cultural product. Artists in Argentina and in Brazil, in Venezuela, Uruguay, independently developed a full-fledged understanding of systematic concrete art in which the literal prevailed over individual figurative expression. The reasons for pursuing the literal varied in each case, but what didn't vary was the mobilization of the term concrete. Concrete is a term that will come to refer to a non-idealistic, non-metaphorical aesthetic in which nothing is abstracted. A literal aesthetic in which what you see, as somebody like Frank Stella will say, what you see is what you see, or the minimalists will argue, All you need to really focus on is what you're looking at. There's nothing there, nothing beyond that. That's the literal, concrete dimension that I'm referring to. The work of these artists had neither prior associations with nature, nor any figural or narrative significance. The concrete paintings and sculptures stood for nothing but themselves. Artists' turn to the literal in the 1950s and 60s was actually a turn away from abstraction. For instance, Uruguayan artists such as Rod Rodfuss and Carmelo Arden Quinn argued that the work of painters who pioneered abstract art, insofar as it didn't problematize the conventional window frame effect of the rectangular composition, still related to the natural world in a figural manner. They saw the rectilinear frame, the rectangle or square, if you will, which has been traditional in painterly compositions for many centuries at that point, and was developed in the Renaissance and conceived to function as a window into a fictional three-dimensional space. They saw the rectilinear frame as at odds with their stated attempt to eliminate the illusion of space inherent to the dominant conventions of Western painting. The representation of space in a painting is always an illusion, it's always a fiction, and what these artists were seeking to do was to eliminate the fictional and present a painting that was more honest about what was being presented, namely a flat surface with various forms arranged on it. Instead, the artists now began to call for what they called the broken frame that does away once and for all with illusionistic traces of depth and emphasizes the objectness of painting. The argument being that if we can get rid of the rectilinear framework of a canvas and make paintings that don't have that rectangle, people will begin to see the painting as what it is, namely as an object in the room, as opposed to a window to another space. The broken frame liberates the conventions of painting from their representational function and brings an end to the fiction of the image in favor of an emphasis on the presence of pure plastic components. South American concrete artists also argued that the irregularly shaped painting prompts artists and viewers alike to rethink the perimeter between the virtual space of the art object and the actual space of the exhibition site in which that art object is exhibited. The painterly object, as a literal element, can at this moment interrelate with the spatial and architectural context in which it's shown, and function as an integral component of that environment. Here lies one of the central contradictions that will characterize much concrete art in this region of the world. The broken frame will function as the key tool towards the production of the literal artistic object, purely self-reflexive, beginning and ending in its own, as well as the hinge to expand the pictorial composition beyond the parameters of the traditional picture plane and into a relationship with the surrounding environment. Many of the artworks of these artists grappled with the problem of the frame, especially the contradictory pulls of a broken or irregular frame, staged to create a dramatic confrontation of opposing qualities, such as the expansion into space and contraction into nothingness. Their iconography featured simple elements applied to flat, neutral backgrounds, with an integral structure of form and color establishing the dynamic interplay of the pictorial relations. A case in point is the canvas that I show you here on the screen by the artist Thomas Maldonado. This is, as you can see, a seven-sided polygonal painting from 1945. And as you see, the geometric composition features an off-white monochrome background with a smooth polished surface and neutral brush strokes, which obviously you can't see on the slides, but if one saw the canvas, the brush strokes would be almost invisible to detect. Near the center of this expansive white field let's see how this works here. I don't dare do this. Well, at the center here, right here, you have two geometric elements, as you can see, that look like they come from a mathematics textbook. One of them is black with four sides of varying length, and the other, a smaller one, forms a red triangle. A red rectangle. The two elements play on each other as well as in relation to the framing edges of the composition. One of the things that immediately happens in viewing a work like this is an attempt to make sense of the relationship between the forms in the center and the framing edges that structure those forms or that surround those forms. Together, the two forms within the white field create several angles that produce a dynamic interplay of tensions within the framing edge. The inner forms of the composition float in such a large space that they seem to lose a sense of rationality. Likewise, the red rectangle, as the only regular shape and the only one aligned with the horizontal and vertical axes, seems like a misfit in this composition. The irregular angles of the frame and black shape have an inevitable resemblance because they seem arbitrary in their tilts and angles. The black shape also resonates with the curious notch in the frame over here, as if this had been removed from that notch. There's dialogue between what's in the center and the periphery in this case, which relates in scale to the inner shape of that black form. The black and red forms in the off-white field seem to come forward towards the viewer, but they're kept in check, and the warm browns of the trim of the frame, which was also part of the composition in this case, flatten the whole composition once again, and the result is one of indeterminacy. The composition is thus locked in a definite, though tenuous state, at once expanding and contracting, yet complete in and of itself. South American concrete artists also develop the form of what they refer to as the coplano, another term I'd like to introduce. This consisted of a thorough reexamination of the picture or cutout frame. Initially, this reconsideration resulted in compositions that physically separated geometric forms in space. The cutout forms each had their own shape and color. The composition held irregular shapes together from behind by thin metal bars initially, the thin metal bars or rods without being contained in a frame of any type. So you have these compositions that the painting is these four elements, but the four elements are held together by that thin metal frame that you see in this case. In the other case, there are more elements and four. As one composition, not as four compositions that make a whole, but as one composition in and of itself. Then the artist eliminated the bars as the next logical step and incorporated the space between the geometric forms into the heart of the composition as a constitutive element. So at the point where the bars that were holding these pieces together is eliminated, one then has to think of the wall as a part of the work too, right? The wall becomes fundamental to the work. And therefore, it's hard to separate the various forms that you see of the composition from the supporting wall that is holding those forms. And there's a lot of slippage that begins to take place between those components of the composition. They related positive and negative to each other through mathematical proportions and color combinations. And mathematics was very crucial to the production of these artists at that time, as was scientific experimentation, as I'll discuss in a moment, and kept the compositions on a single level plane. This is what the artists described as the coplanal arrangement. Ultimately, the materiality of the coplanal resolves the conceptual obstacle presented by abstract painting, since it effectively eliminates all traces of figural representation by reducing art to its most objective literal elements. Just as the coplanal seemed to vindicate the medium of painting, it also seemed to bring the medium of painting to a logical conclusion. Argentinian artist Alberto Molenberg's white function, Función Blanca, that I show you on the screen, is an open structure composed of 3 irregular elements separated from each other in fixed relationships and connected to the wall. The negative shapes belong to the ground. A smooth coat of white enamel paint covers the 3 blocks of plywood. The formal relationship of the 3 white monochrome panels initially seems random, but the panels are in fact structured by an array of edges that correlate across the empty space. Certain edges echo and parallel and intersect one another in complex ways, but these relationships are only between the forms themselves and don't involve a frame. The composition's monochrome whiteness, together with the dynamism of the expanding compositional lines, leads the eye to the surrounding space, beyond the white forms, with the inevitable result of integrating art with architecture, and ultimately integrating art with design, and opening it to the spectator's experience. So concrete art's shift from the figural to the literal, from representation to presentation, from painting to material object, transforms the beholder, the spectator, from a passive recipient in front of a fictional image into an active participant in the making sense of the literal elements of the composition. It gives the spectator, it puts the spectator in a much more active position of composing, of making the composition. The artist presents the spectator with elements. The spectator puts those elements into, composes those elements into a single aesthetic form. It renders the question of what the art object's informational and symbolic meanings are moot, and gives priority to the importance of a third meaning, namely what the viewer sees and interprets in his or her engagement with the literal object and its surrounding environment. This introduces a concept of artistic meaning, artistic signification, that assumes that meaning is something that one can only produce in the site where the art object and the spectator meet, where the subject and the object come together. Meaning is something that in art that is generated not by the artist in the relationship with the object that the artist makes, but by the object in relationship with the spectator that engages with it. I refer to this intersection as the aesthetic field of the artwork, defining the aesthetic field first and foremost as an area of possibility through which the spectator constructs meaning. And for a greater elaboration of the aesthetic field, I should send you to my book, Abstraction in Reverse. By reshaping the aesthetic field to posit now the spectator, not as a disembodied receptor of optical stimuli, but as an active subject engaged in a new kind of tactile encounter, a new kind of attentiveness, artists in the mid-20th century opened the way for new modes of experience, new modes of consciousness, as well as new models of subject-object relations. They produced artworks that challenged the prevailing notions of the interconnection between subject and world, perceiver and perceived, objective reality and subjective experience. And in this new conceptualization, art was no longer considered entirely autonomous and internally coherent, but relationally dynamic, prompting the imaginative engagement of the viewer and producing meaning through this very relationality with the spectators that engaged with the artwork. The rationales underlying the generation of this art varied, as did the degrees and conditions of subjective agency that this type of art actualized, but the new interactive forms fundamentally reconfigured the aesthetic field and modernist spectatorship more generally. Now, the artist Jesus Soto, one of whose works is featured in this show, Soto's early 1950s canvases worked with systematic repetition of simple geometric forms. This is where he begins his production. This systematic repetition of simple geometric forms or literal elements in light and dark colors on a black surface. Soto developed a vocabulary of serially ordered elements rather than compose his paintings through intuitive processes or notions of balance. He constructed them following a predetermined serial order. This serial principle characterizes works such as Serial Painting and Untitled Study for a Series, both from 1952-53 that I show you here on the screen, which, as you can see, consists of identical modular units reduced to standardized forms and repeated across the canvas. Philosophically, the pictorial structure extended in all directions to infinity. Once one understands the serial system that's organized on the canvas, one can imagine this extending in all directions infinitely. Repetition as an order that, like the grid, an artist can repeat endlessly with each fragment equal to the whole obliterates composition. The juggling of these simple geometric patterns of rectangles and squares could construct pictures without really composing at all. These experiments with seriality soon led Soto to focus on the relationship between space and time. To do this, he reduced the size of the art object and the design and placed small quadrangles of white color in straight horizontal or vertical lines, with the addition of fine exterior lines placed circularly around them, giving them a sense of rotating movement. As you can see, the thin black lines of rotation, I'm not sure how much you can actually see with this slide, but the thin black lines of rotation of 1952 on the screen are placed one at a time on each of the four sides of those small white forms, giving each of those tiny squares the sense of rotating on their axes. The rotations and progressions that form the groundwork of Soto's serial paintings led to the production of artworks that, though presented on a single flat plane, pushed the logic further to create a situation of depth through superimposition of what the artist described as two vibrations, two repetitions, and superimposed progressions. These superimpositions gave the forms an illusion of movement. They seem to move or seem to want to move or begin to suggest movement. Metamorphosis, which I show you on the screen, for instance, is based on a grid of small squares inscribed on a plexiglass surface, extending forward from the ground and placed at an angle over another grid of the same composition. The overlapping at a slight angle of identically patterned planes produces not only different densities, unequal concentrations of dots, and ultimately masses of different forms, but also a distinct vibratory effect. The way this works is that the optical interference between the two elements releases a third element, the vibration, which is literal to the human eye, but has no actual material existence. The movement that Soto will discover does not take place on the artwork, it's on the object itself. The movement takes place on the retina of the spectator. So the retina of the spectator makes the work move The work is this literal trigger for the retina of the spectator, once again emphasizing this relationship between the object and the spectator in the production of the composition. It was at this moment that another component joined the differentiation of the exhibited object that had thus far characterized Soto's 1950s work, namely the increased interaction with the spectator, who would now form a part of a new visual situation and shift the aesthetic field. Indeed, Soto's work began to take on another level of movement beyond the canvas and dependent on the dynamics of the viewer's physical presence to achieve the visual effect of vibration. And this is something that's very active in the piece by Soto that is on display upstairs. Works such as Metamorphoses don't move, in other words, but when the spectator moves, when the spectator ambulates in front of such two-layer transparent compositions, the patterns on the composition begin to interact with the spectator's retina to generate movement. With the spectator's sideways movement, the square plane closest to the eye seems to float in front of the second, deeper plane with enough speed to cause a retinal disturbance. Intangibility becomes tangible, and space takes on an element of time. Yet it's important to emphasize that the work incorporates time and space not through the use of a motor, which characterized the work of previous kinetic art, but through the use of the transparent material of plexiglass and the mobility of the spectator. In this way, the kinetic, vibratory quality of works such as Metamorphosis lies in the agency of the individual spectator. The effect of movement in the work depends on the essential physical movement of each viewer's body in front of the work, parallel to the picture plane. The moving human body, this newly activated spectator participant, completes the action of the work. The vibration in the eye of the spectator that works such as Metamorphosis create is more than simply an optical illusion. The optical vibration takes on a literal bodily incorporation, as it is the spectator, and the spectator's eye in particular, who completes the work through a participatory interaction with the object. Soto's spiral relief of 1955 is one of the most striking early examples of his new kinetic art, structured by the superimposition of compositional elements capable of lending optical movement to the picture plane. The relief, as you can see, is composed of two spirals, one of which is painted white on a sheet of transparent plexiglass, superimposed at a distance of 10 inches or so in front of the other larger spiral painted black on a white wooden surface. The superimposed spirals, juxtaposed to the intervening blank space, create a kind of dazzle of continuous vibrations and engender an optical sensation of virtual movement and volume. Spiral relief alters the physical qualities of diverse materials in such a way that they lose their solidity and their volume and their weight through surprisingly simple optical manipulations. Materiality and immateriality come into increased tension. Moreover, when the viewer moves laterally across the work, the lines of the spirals join and separate, and the two layers alternately contract and expand. The incessant rippling movement in this work and others like it differs significantly from the type of movement previously obtained by the mere repetition of elements on a flat surface. But it's also completely different. It's also of a completely different order than movement obtained by mechanical means. Indeed, an important precedent for spiral relief was rotary glass plates, precision objects, the machine that Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray developed in the 1920s to produce optical illusions by generating virtual volumes through the superimposition of spinning planes. But whereas this precedent created a sustained illusion, an optical effect that the viewer can observe or neglect without affecting the artwork's operation, Soto's work depends much more radically on the spectator's bodily presence for its movement. There's no motor here. It's the spectator's movement is the motor, and the eye is the engine of the movement. The work enters a new form of optical relationship with the viewer. That relationship, the significance of the viewer's participation, connects not to interpretation or understanding, but rather to the viewer's physiological and even phenomenological experience. What Soto had discovered, in fact, was a phenomenon that will come to be known as the Moire Effect. This optical effect occurs when two nearly identical sets of lines or dots overlap, but slightly out of alignment. When a space separates the two superimposed sections and one walks in front of them, the shadowy rings expand and merge and disappear and reappear. The curves and waves move across the structure, upwards and downwards, and the broken line may disintegrate further, reform, or even disappear altogether if it falls along one of the background lines. For Soto, Moire offered immense possibilities that went considerably beyond those offered by the anti-subjective total rationalization of the aesthetic that he had developed in the immediately preceding years in the work that I just described a few moments ago. And here I'm juxtaposing Soto's spiral relief with Bridget Riley's Annal, which is featured in the present exhibition upstairs, to make the point about the legacy of Soto's discovery of the Moire Effect. Soto found that the Moire Effect allowed his work to protrude further into space, to come forward instead of. So what we're seeing here then is the flip, the opposite of the rectangular window of painting compositions where one looks at the painting and looks through the wall into a space that the window imagines for you, a space that the window produces as an illusion, to now the painting, the forms of the painting not going further into space but coming forward towards the spectator. This is what I mean by the reverse of abstraction. The way that this type of abstract work comes forward towards the spectator rather than allows the spectator to go through it, through a window into another space altogether. Soto found that the Moire Effect allowed his work to protrude further into space, and his subsequent works became increasingly complex, with multiple extending elements of plexiglass sheets or multiplied patterns layered through compositions. This is most evident in compositions such as Double Transparency of 1956. The work relies again on a parallel movement of the spectator's body across the picture plane and its multiple patterns of colored vertical lines that produce an ever greater sense of movement. Double Transparencies, multiple transparent levels of foreground, middle ground, and background allow for a great deal of vibratory movement depending on the location of the viewer's eye in relation to the piece. Its colored lines of yellow, black, gray, and white further distinguish each element while enhancing their kinetic interactions. The vibratory effects produced by the interactions of various elements within the work and the spectator's own displacement in space generates movement. Unlike the work of, say, Naum Gabo or Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, which achieves movement through physical oscillations, in Soto's work, these effects occur on the retina of the spectator. The optical kinetic principle will come to be the point of departure for Soto, as much as for much kinetic and op art in the following years. The work of Julio Leparc provides an excellent example of this trajectory, and let me focus on this as we begin to move towards a conclusion. Leparc's early 1960s experiments typically took the form of mobile relief sculptures consisting of sets of thin plastic squares or metal units with shiny surfaces strung out at regular intervals on nylon threads and suspended in front of a wooden board, often painted white. Like Alexander Rodchenko's hanging wire constructions of the early 1920s, or Alexander Calder's mobiles of the mid-20th century, the elements of Leparc's suspended ensembles move in response to the air currents, continuously changing their relative position. But Leparc's 1960s sculpture also expands into the exhibition space, creating an environmental effect by casting shadows and reflections into the room, generating an installation, if you will. As light falls on the undulating units, their actual movement projects haphazardly onto the surrounding walls, and their silhouettes and radiations shimmer in space. Here, the plays between reality and appearance. The sheets of light resonate like echoes in the exhibition space and vary in shape and intensity according to the position of the spectator and the location of the illuminating structure, the illuminating source. From the spectator's point of view, a work of art made of light seems more immaterial than an opaque image, even though this is obviously not true, since light is just as material a substance as any other. Moreover, a luminous artwork has an intrinsic temporal dimension. Time enters into this type of work simply because it's almost impossible to conceive of light in any but temporal terms, as light isn't a state, but light is a process that moves in time. Leparc's 1960s mobiles thus use vernacular materials, divorced or abstracted from their normal context, and develop a process that occurs in the viewer's own time. Occasionally, a shiny square illuminates brilliantly as it reflects the spotlight directly. Leparc's observation of the prospects opened by or exploration of the prospects opened by the combination of transparency, movement, and light led him to a concerted investigation of the various ways in which the mobile relief sculptures relate to human perception. The effect he found is that of a continuity that sets off a discontinuity. The mobiles maintain enough sameness from one moment to the next for the slight differences to jump the spectator's attention forward and backward in time. And in this sense, they imitate consciousness and the mind's eye. How do we perceive things? How do we anticipate things? How do we remember things? Not as dramatic scenes, but as projected or retrieved moments. Not in coherent wholes, but in bits and pieces and fragments. We think in parts more than in wholes. And try as we might to fit those parts together, discontinuities remain. Moments and details keep emerging or coming back to us as images in their own right, a little different each time as they shift in the mind. The Illuminated Mobile is the device that Leparc uses to evoke this process or projection, or recollection, and instability is the term that he uses to refer to it. Joining together with several artists in the early 1960s in the group Grave in Paris, Leparc and his colleagues set out to produce art whose primary aim was to study the physiological relationship between compositions of form on the one hand and the eye of the spectator on the other. The primary reason for taking the pure response of the human eye as a starting point was that the human eye is egalitarian. The part played by the eye, according to these artists, is common to everybody. Everybody shares that same response, that same retinal response. It's not esoteric. An eye devoid of all emotion and symbolism gives every eye the same sensation, regardless of class or race or gender. This investigation led to the collapse of the distinction between figural space and the literal space of the spectator, and to the production of contingent artworks that place increasing emphasis on the viewer's reception. Leparc and Grave came to consider the optical instability produced by information overload as a physiological effect based on the properties of the retina. Instead of seeking ways to stabilize these optical conditions, they worked with them, putting together compositions with multiple focal points that produce a succession of ever-differing perceptual conditions and a shifting continuum of sensations. This accentuated the position of the spectator, who now had to order the strong pull of each of the different centers of the artwork in relation to his or her position in space. In formal terms, Leparc's search for visual information that incorporates contextual and temporal aspects, as well as a certain degree of randomness, led him to produce kinetic artworks that mobilize chance, that mobilize indeterminacy, and as a fundamental component. Their dynamic structure gives rise to many conceivable visual possibilities that unfold in the spectator's perception. The multiple possible consolidations of this type of work are equivalent, meaning that there's no correct way in which to integrate a composition. The particularities of perception are always different, always contingent on several factors, and each spectator develops his or her own particular interpretation. Leparc's continual Lumière objects typically consist of a light beam projected into a circular unit in which the artist arranged several small sheets of polished aluminum perpendicular to the viewer's perspective. The steady counter-rotation of asymmetrical fan blades within these devices corrupt the ray of light that is entering into them. The aluminum sheets reflect the projected light and produce an intricate movement of luminous images and courses of light across the surface plane. This accentuates the perceptibility of a light signal in relation to the interference produced by movement. But the full visual effect depends on the motion of the spectator in the space in which the art object is installed. When a spectator stands in front of the art object, the lines of light appear to shift across the surface in all directions. But as the spectator moves laterally before the artwork, the fan blades reflect the light beams forward into the space of the room. From this perspective, the artwork extends beyond the viewing subject to include the entire ensemble of equipment and operation necessary, including the mechanism of projection considered in all of its technical aspects, the room into which the mechanism casts the broken beams of light, as well as the reception side of the artistic apparatus. It's not simply a matter of the art object influencing the spectator, but of a kind of symbiotic relationship between the entire apparatus of the artwork and the subjectivity of the spectator in space and in time. The turn to action and participation in the context of spectatorship in the mid-20th century art also marks a shift to an entirely different mode of social engagement with the artwork. The model of spectatorship that develops as artists attempt to reintegrate art into the social realm by asserting its relationship with the viewing object turns outwards into the third and even fourth dimensions, if you want to include time. Many of the artworks in the Going Global Abstract Art at Mid-Century exhibition are in one way or another examples of this phenomenon. The gap between the ostensible permanence of the art object and the ephemerality of the spectator's interaction with that art object narrows and in some cases collapses altogether. And on the right, I show you a video clip of an anonymous Centre Pompidou spectator's experience with Jakob Agam's double Metamorphosis of 1968, which is not that unlike Agam's New Year included in the exhibition. Many of these artworks cease to be stationary objects accessible to immediate and exhaustive viewing that is seen in their entirety and invite an embodied reception located in space and time. The artistic experience becomes a transitional phenomenon, prompting the spectator to relate not only with the object, but also with other spectators in the room and with the surrounding environment as a whole. But rather than rest in the moment of desublimation, artworks produced in this manner, and here I'm speaking more specifically about installations in exhibition spaces than multiples, induce spectators to see themselves both as integral subjects and as objects of the perception of others. This creates new spaces of sociability. Gone is the myth of the singular artist in absolute control of his or her creative production. Gone, too, is the traditional understanding of the ontology of art in which the artwork and its conceptualized essence stand apart from the world, unchanging for all time. And in place of these singularities, these artworks posit a relational identity and set of processual operations that are not atavistic but disjointed, having multiple roots and facets and directions. The subjective agency and creativity of the spectator become paramount in art's realization. Thanks. I'll stop here and take questions. Now, I know there was a lot of information. I'm happy to air out some of the larger arguments. I tried to repeat several times the move to the relationship between the spectator and the object as a crucial component of these mid-20th century experiments with abstraction. And as I said, my primary interest in exploring that phenomenon was prompted by things that I see in art galleries today so often, and museums today so often, things that characterize so much contemporary art. But I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
Thank you, Alex. Particularly the Argentine material at the beginning, the concrete art, I don't know much about that, so that was really interesting. I have a perspective on this that maybe you'll disagree with, but we'll see. And I was just curious, the experience of these works, particularly the Juliola Park, is virtually not quite unique, but unique to almost every viewer that comes in to see it, particularly the piece, the particular configurations as stuff moves around. And so each person going into the gallery has a slightly different experience from anybody else, even though the artwork that's making that experience happen is the same one each time. And I wonder how much that reflects or has some kind of relationship to consumerism and mass culture and all the stuff that's happening that the US and Western Europe is exporting to other parts of the world with things like, Coca-Cola and Campbell's Soup and all of these things that we know aren't unique, but our consumption of them or our use of them feels unique to us. So, you buy a new car and it feels like your own special car, even though it's just like everybody else's car. I don't know if that's, I don't think that runs against the grain of some of the stuff you're saying.
Yeah.
But I was just trying to square it with the bigger experience of the world in those decades.
I mean, what you're describing is certainly a backdrop of of mid-20th century art in general, where consumerism becomes so crucial let's just say mass consumerism is something that proliferates in mid-20th century, and one sees traces of that in all kinds of art production in many different ways. And I think that the way that you just indicated is one of those ways. Something to keep in mind, though, is that these artists saw themselves as scientists. They really were, in the 1950s, they were making a lot of collaborations with science. With somebody like Soto. Soto was his best friend was Pierre Boulez, a musician. So it's not science, it's mathematics. So they saw themselves as mathematicians and scientists, but scientists of empirical matter. They wanted to take the art from, this is what I discovered in my research. They wanted to be seen as the equivalent of a scientist who was working with not metaphorical, elusive, figural, creative, imaginative things, but with empirical data that affects the eye. And this is a reason why a lot of scientists did turn to their work. I mean, this is a moment where science is learning from art as much as art is trying to imitate science. They're going back and forth quite a bit in that moment. As with serial music or serial dance. So you have, on the one hand, it's true that the artist is responding to the social environment of the Marshall Plan and the consumer society that one sees proliferate after the Second World War. But I don't want to miss the fact that these artists saw what they were doing as something that was as serious as a scientist project, for better or for worse, And the results were what you see on the wall, but there was a lot of experimentation along the way, trying to figure out why the eye dazzles. What is it that gets the retina to move when certain things happen? And so what's interesting is somebody like Soto is a very good case. It's like a test case of step by step by step, trying to figure out the phenomenon, but through visual terms, not through writing or even in a more traditional scientific experiment in the lab, but here it's just through painting and through careful looking. So it's a moment where, on the one hand, as you follow my argument, the spectator comes to have a greater role than ever before, and the relationship between the spectator and the object becomes superior to that between the artist and the object. On the other hand, the artist is all powerful there because the artist is the maker, is devising these objects that trigger the spectator and attempt to understand perception in and of itself. Yes?
I apologize if this question is answered in the exhibit. I haven't seen the exhibit yet. But all the artists that you were presenting are all from South America, or most of them.
Yeah, most of them.
The large majority were South American. And, of course, Muslim, Holy Naji, and so forth are not. But just wondering if this is to what extent the art you're showing, or what is the unique vision or response that Latin American or South American artists and the artistic community that they existed in and communicated within, what is unique to that and separates it, if anything, from similar movements and thoughts in the United States or in Europe? And were they, I hate to use the word derivative, but were they derivative, or were they influencing the outside, the other parts of the world?
No, these are great questions. First of all, I'm focusing on Latin American artists to try to give it a framework so it's not all over, and I centered in on the Latin American part in this story. But keep in mind that the artists, almost to every one of them, none of them lived in Latin America. They were almost all in Paris at that time, some in New York. So Soto is in Paris from the age of 19, and Le Parc and these people. So it's really a Western European phenomenon, and a lot of the people that were involved with these experiments, Vasarely, Tangali, many artists were not Latin American. What was it, though, that led so many Latin American artists to explore with these to move towards Op Kinetic Participatory Art? That's a good question. What I could say to the second part of the question is that they weren't cribbing from others, unless you want to think of somebody like Duchamp or Calder or Moholy-Nagy, who were obviously crucial figures. There was this guy also, Van Tongerloo, a relatively unknown artist from Belgium who was a mathematician, was making a lot of work along with the neoplasticists, with Mondrian and these people who were crucial for these figures. But subsequently, within the context of the US, only by a few years, but the group of what comes to be called the minimal artists will come to do very similar things, and the work will start to look quite similar. Not that there's anybody's, artists are in dialogue with each other, and they're not. I wouldn't argue that there's an appropriation, but there's a continuation of a dialogue, of a discussion, which comes to shape a lot of U.S. and Western European minimal and conceptual art, and then some into in the 60s and 1970s. So it was really, the question that I haven't answered, which is the toughest one probably, is why did so many Latin American artists move in this direction at this particular moment in time? And I've contemplated this from various different perspectives, and a good portion of the artists in the show upstairs are also Latin American. One of the things I suggest in the book, and it's a suggestion, and I wrote it, so I'm saying it, but I'm not fully convinced, is that in the context of dictatorship, one has to be very careful with figurative representation, because you can get into a lot of trouble very quickly representing figuratively. And so if one moves to abstract art, you can make all kinds of different, you have a lot more leeway in terms of how you can interpret it if you're actually asked to say, what are you doing here? What is this? We're in a context in the mid-20th century, Latin American context, with many dictatorships. You couldn't do something like the siqueiros that you have on the way into this museum. That would be death, probably. Certainly, that would be punishment of some sort. Abstract art is a way where when an artist can continue to experiment and explore ideas, and as you can see, they're ideas of a certain sophistication, and yet evade the dangers that may await at the next turn. That's what I suggested in the book. I'm half convinced of that today. I think it's more complicated than that, but that was the initial suggestion. So I have a question here and then one there.
Yes, well, I have two questions. One, with what the difference is between kinetic art and op art, and the second question had to do with the coplanos. Since each part of the coplano existed independently when they were liberated, so to speak, from the wires, then it would be up to the artist himself to arrange those pieces? Was there a fixed way they had to be arranged, or could they be arranged?
Second question first. The coplano, it's what's interesting. I would love to see this show. The coplanos were always drawn out beforehand and then arranged on the wall. In other words, there was a drawing as to how the forms would arrange with each other. They're mathematical constructions. They're these kind of vectors on these drawings. I've seen some of the drawings, and in the vectors you'll have these forms, and then they'll make some of the forms and not some of the other forms. So in fact, they're based on drawings, of which some of the forms in the drawing, I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but the drawings are these multiple vectors of lines, and within those multiple vectors of lines, you have these solid forms, these forms that could be solidified, and then negate the rest of it. And so in installing a coplano, it's an attempt to repeat what was initially drawn on the page in terms of the composition. So they are compositions. They can't be arranged in different ways each time, in other words. words. They're standard sets of compositions. And my understanding is that coplanos come along with the drawing of how to install. So this is how you would put it on the wall. 50 years later, when nobody remembers what these 4 objects were, well, you have a how-to. The first question, the relationship between op and kinetic art. Well, op art is optical art that works on the optical apparatus of the spectator, of the human. Kinetic art is art that moves. Just 2 definitions, right? Kinetic art, art that moves. Op art, art that operates on the optical apparatus that we as humans have. If the art makes the optical apparatus flicker or quiver or shimmer, it's kinetic. In other words, some op art is kinetic. When one looks at the Bridget Riley upstairs, or when one walks across the Cruz Diaz upstairs, or the Soto, it seems to move, but it doesn't. It's an optical movement. It moves in your retina. It doesn't really move. The object is static. So the short is, the skinny on this is that some op art, a lot of op art, is kinetic. But not all kinetic art is op art.
Wouldn't, going back to the previous question, wouldn't like the Nazi period where abstract art was completely crushed and banned be the counterexample to the safety of doing abstract art?
Sure.
I forget the artist's name, but one got through the war by claiming he was doing studies for camouflage,
That's good.
which is like the closest you could get to approval at that.
Right. No, it's true. I mean, abstract art, in the Latin American context, they weren't that concerned about abstract art. See, the thing is, here's the thing. In Latin America, as you know, in the dictatorships of the mid-20th century, they're right-wing dictatorships, anti-communist. And the communists hated abstract art. So if an artist is working in abstract art, it's like, well, he must be part of our, I mean, they were in this situation where they were hated by the enemy of the dictators. And therefore, it's very complicated. And there's also, I mean, another element of this is a large Jewish component. A lot of these artists were families that had gone to Latin America in exile in the 20th century. And they brought their knowledge of the Bauhaus, and they brought their knowledge of Russian constructivism, and they brought all this knowledge to South America, and were engaged in a dialogue with each other. But to come back to the question about Latin America, in a dialogue with, it wasn't just Latin American, it was a dialogue with the mid-20th century. It's a 20th century dialogue. A lot of them were diasporic, even in Latin America. And then they get up and they go back to Europe in the 50s, 60s, or to New York. So there was a lot of movement, and the names kind of, Le Parc. The names give you this already. They're artists who, like so many artists today, are in perpetual motion.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. This has been great.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you.